Hello, dear students of Architektur, Geschichte und Theorie. I hope you are all doing well, and I hope you are all following the courses and the videos. And some of you have been a little bit silent, others have sent some feedback. So I would like just to make a little bit a stand or a point in the situation. I would like you to be a little bit more active and perhaps send more emails, more contacts, more questions, so that I can know from that side how you are receiving the videos, how you're receiving the material, and in general also how you are dealing with the content of the course, because I know that the content sometimes can be a little bit dense, and I'm sure that you have questions. I'm sure that you would like to make this also a little bit more interactive. So please don't be shy. Feel free to write me, and if necessary, we can also make a live streaming session, and we can put the topics and put your doubts also into discussion. Also, I hope that your semester is proceeding well as much as possible, and also that you are healthy and that you are doing well in this situation. So this was just a little introduction now. So we will continue now with lesson number 8, which has the title "The Essential Body and the Performative Body." So, as referred to before in the previous lessons, Phenomenology appeared in the 20s in Germany, and it was established mainly by the philosopher Husserl as the study of essences and modes of consciousness, although also developed by Hegel, who was more interested in exploring phenomena as connected to the spirit, since in the German language, as you know very well, the same word Geist is applied to the mind. So these two main branches of phenomenology, respectively Transcendental Phenomenology and Dialectical Phenomenology, would be developed mostly by two philosophers, the first Maurice Merleau-Ponty and the second Martin Heidegger. We will not delve too much into Heidegger, but we will further work a little bit more on Merleau-Ponty, but in any case it's important to refer. These two philosophers would become, in the second half of the 20th century, the source of inspiration for some of the most significant approaches to architecture revealed in both theory, with the writings of Norberg Schulz, Pallasma, Perez Gomez, Rickwert, and Thies Evensen, and in practice of architecture, Stephen Hall and Peter Zumthor. These authors defend a phenomenological approach to architectural design, trying to express through their work the sensorial experience of the body in architectural space as a unique way of being that speaks to all my senses at the same time, as stated by Merleau-Ponty in his Phenomenology of Perception. Husserl would also have as a discipline the already referred to Edith Stein, who did her doctoral dissertation under Husserl's orientation. To our knowledge, her ideas on empathy haven't been considered yet fully in the field of architecture and are still an open door for discussion. And this is also what I would like to introduce you. As you remember from the last classes, this idea of empathy and how we go through this historical revision, and we see that the idea of empathy was really growing in importance in philosophical studies, and of course now more recently in neuroscience. And now we also have the possibility of reintegrating this idea that of course had this background in aesthetics and philosophy, this idea of empathy as fundamental aspect of the experience of architecture, and of course interior design, architectural space. So Edith Stein followed the phenomenological reduction to approach the topic of empathy, and her text is an example of how this method is based on the conscious direction of one's attention to the body in an effort to understand the process that constructs interpretation and meaning. It also reveals an unexplored reflection on the performance of the body in space as experienced by oneself. Here one sees the indirect influence of Visha. You remember we spoke about Visha in the lessons before, whose ideas on empathy had been adopted by Lipps, who would incorporate later in his life some of Husserl's ideas on phenomenology, who in turn was very critical of Lipps' psychologism, defending experience as the source of all knowledge and breaking with the pure empiricism advocated by positivism in philosophy and science. So you can see here how Visha, for example, and already was trying to break from this empiricism of positivism. You remember when we spoke about positivism, positivism really had this strong emphasis on scientific, on an approach to science which is purely empirical. And so these theories of empathy, they have a scientific basis. Of course, they are also connected to psychology, although, for example, Visha was also a little bit, he was influenced by Lipps psychology theories. But for example, in philosophy, Husserl, who was one of these founding fathers of phenomenology, was not so interested in the psychological approach to the topic of experience, and Husserl was really interested in breaking free from the positivist empiricist approach, and also from psychology. So he really wanted to focus on the experience of the human, so this subjective, personal, individual aspect, as the source of knowledge. So not only data and not only science, but also personal experience. So this whole subjective, we could say before existentialism, but existential dimension of the experience of being human and the experience of having a body, and how perception works through the body. So it was through Husserl's influence that the generally accepted Cartesian, you remember from Descartes, the division between body and mind, it was generally accepted that the Cartesian division between body and mind was finally broken, and phenomenology would reflect and influence the aesthetic that generated many of the artistic avant-garde manifestations of the first half of the 20th century. Phenomenology brought attention to the matter of consciousness, and along with it, the importance of the concepts of space and time, matter and memory, the real and virtual possibilities of the mind. Most importantly, phenomenology tried to solve such old dichotomies by adopting a unified approach considering both elements as parts of a whole. So the whole idea of phenomenology was not to separate body and mind, was really to consider these things as the two faces of one coin. An interesting detail, which is usually disregarded, is Husserl's early years' relationship to mathematics. In fact, Husserl did his PhD, or his Doktorarbeit, in mathematics, which explains the importance he would give to logic and justifies his disliking of psychologism. Therefore, since its foundation, phenomenology seeks to be scientific, defending an objective analysis of topics such as consciousness, perception, emotion, intuition, and judgment, which are usually regarded as subjective. Of course, here we have a bit of a paradox, because in fact these topics do relate to the subjective experience of an individual making meaning and experiencing the world. But phenomenology at the same time is scientific, since it addresses such topics not from an empiricist perspective, but with an objective stance. This came from a growing awareness of the importance of keeping the health of bodies in the city, but also as a reaction first to the enthusiasm and then to the excesses of positivism. Körperkultur represented at first liberation, and this meant from traditional gastronomy habits to women's and men's attire, to their social roles as individuals or couples, and of course their relation to society and the city. So Körperkultur, as you know, of course, in Germany, appeared also from this interest in the topics of consciousness, of perception, but also of cultivating the body as a unified whole, which is also the source of experience and the source of joy, the source of health, and the source of vitality. Garden cities followed a method of urban planning initiated by Sir Ebenezer Howard in England in 1898, and were idealized as places where self-sustaining communities, on a rather small scale, could enjoy the closeness of nature and support their inhabitants with locally produced goods. Some of these communities didn't have exactly the best reputation among the common citizen, as they did attract most of the avant-garde and their interest in exploring vegetarianism, naturism, yoga, or eurythmics. It was near the city of Dessau that such a community was founded, referred to Harry Francis Malgrave, we mentioned the work of Malgrave before, as the Hellerau experiment. So Hellerau was a city now in what is called Eastern Germany, near Leipzig, and in Hellerau there was really this community, you could say a little bit like before the hippies, but a little bit like a hippie community of people who were interested in exploring Körperkultur. So they were interested in dance, and they were interested also in yoga, vegetarianism, and alternative ways of living, but also getting closer to nature, but also exploring alternative ways of life that would break free from positivism, of course, and that would break free also from the bourgeois codes and protocols of life. Many of the Bauhaus masters had spent some time in Hellerau in the Rosa Institute, or even living in the commune at Monte Veritá in Switzerland, where Rudolf von Laban planted the seeds for the breakthrough of Expressionist dance, following Isadora Duncan's legacy, and particularly the interest in Greek culture and the pagan traditions of ritual, performance, and collective catharsis. So for some images to give you an idea of how one of these communities, this most important community, or one of the first communities, was the Sanatorium Monte Veritá, and here we have some examples. In these images you can see nowadays when we look at images like this, we are not so surprised, because probably many of us already had the experience of going to a festival or experiencing. In Germany you have a very open culture of Körperkultur, so this cult of the body, but at the time these were really radical new experiments. So to take a look at these images, please take a look at figures 8.1 and 8.2. Literature on this subject is very abundant in the German language, although in English these publications are still rather rare. So to talk a little bit more about this topic, we are again referencing the work of Malgrave, who is the main source of reference. So according to Malgrave, the brain, or the person whose idea was behind this Hellerau community, this experiment at the Hellerau community, was Carl Schmitt, an ecologist and social reformer who had the goal of producing well-designed furniture for German middle class, and so founded the German workshops for handcrafted art, which was a predecessor of the Deutsche Werkbund. You probably already heard about the Deutsche Werkbund in Designgeschichte and also probably in art history, in your first models on art history. With the success of this first step, noting that the workshops were producing furniture designed by names such as Behrens and Ulbrich, Schmidt, his brother-in-law Riemer Schmidt, and Tessenau founded the Deutsche Werkbund, an alliance of more than 100 artists and industrialists that was originally based in Hellerau. So please take a look at figure 8.3. This is the building by Tessenau, the Dalcroze Institute at Hellerau in 1913. And you can see that the building follows very simple principles of construction. Tessenau was very interested in he was an architect, Tessenau, and he was interested. He worked in the urban planning of this community in Hellerau, and also in this building. And Tessenau's design projects also were very interested in creating new spatial configurations of the interior, which were meant to propose a way of life that it was simpler, that didn't have as much furniture as this very conservative traditional way of life, especially in Germany, and also the Deutsche Werkbund was also very interested in improving the quality of the design projects by increasing the quality of the design, by making an alliance between the industry but also traditional crafts, so that industrially produced objects could have the same quality and the same standards as manually produced objects, so that both the tradition of industry and craft could come together. So besides Schmidt, the other generative force behind the project for the city of Hellerau was Wolf Dorn, an intellectual and artistic collector who made his doctoral degree with Leaps on the topic of empathy, and therefore he was very well aware on most of the recent theories of the time on psychophysiology. Dorn also happened to be the son of a wealthy marine biologist, and he was an advocate protector of the German rural landscape. So the idea of many of these garden cities also appeared in the beginning of the 20th century. They appeared as a reaction also to the poor quality of life and poor health that was being experienced in main cities that were becoming, as we mentioned before, they were becoming increasingly dense, overpopulated, and there were also, of course, hygiene problems, many situations. So there was really this interest in going back to nature as a way to restore some kind of balance, but also of protecting the countryside. So the idea of Hellerau matured from 1906 to 1910, beginning with the founding of the Deutsche Werkbund till the appointment of the Swiss educator Emile Jacques Dalcroze as the director of what would later become the Institute of Rhythmic Dance. Dalcroze was a professor of harmony in Geneva Conservatory and viewed music not as an end in itself, but as a vehicle for individuals to expand their happiness and creativity, harmonizing body and mind. A rather progressive holistic thinking that searched for a coordination between the mind that conceives, the brain which orders, the nerve which transmits, and the muscle which executes. Dalcroze viewed the body as a marvelous instrument of beauty and harmony when it vibrates in tune with artistic imagination and collaborates with creative thought. Dalcroze developed a system of rhythmic gymnastics, which he called eurythmics, I mentioned eurythmics before, with the purpose of developing corporeal awareness in young music students as a way to enhance individual potential with the ultimate goal of social reform, which would lead for a harmonious working of the whole of society. Dalcroze's method was already quite popular even before the foundation of the Institute of Rhythmic Dance in Hellerau. It was during one of Dalcroze's tours with his students that Dorn came to know him and became passionate about this project. Dalcroze had also made a very strong impression in Adolphe Appia, a choreographer who was also affirming himself as one of the main promises of the avant-garde in the field of choreography and stage design. For an example of the work and stage design of Adolphe Appia, please take a look at figure 8.4. Appia had been influenced by Wagner's ideas on the Gesamtkunstwerk, you remember this idea of the total artwork, and believed that theater should be explored by the director through artistic unity, through the synchrony of dynamic and three-dimensional movements by actors, perpendicular scenery, and the use of depth and the horizontal dynamics of the performance space. Appia would influence greatly the world of performing arts, leading towards a reading of the human body in motion as the embodiment of the virtual potentialities of the mind and imagination in space and time. For this he used the calculated play of light and shadow, which became the signature mark of his stage design style. Appia was also influenced greatly by the theater of Meyerhold and his systematic approach to the task of the director. The merging of the actor with the scenography was also one of the intentions of the Futurists, who wanted to make a synthesis of sound, scene, and gesture to create a psychological synchronism in the soul of the spectator, compressing in a few minutes of improvisation innumerable situations, sensibilities, ideas, sensations, facts, and symbols. So as you can see, now I am making the connection to the avant-garde because, of course, as I mentioned before, many of the artists who would become the proponents of the avant-garde, they had connections to Hellerau and they had spent some time there doing these exercises of eurythmics and exploring these alternative ways of life and of community. But they had in common this idea of reforming society by reshaping how the individual thinks, by reshaping how the individual moves. So Körperkultur in this case was also used as an instrument to change people and to change society. So this was the beginning that such ideas appeared. In the next lesson we will see how such ideas were also appropriated by fascist, Nazi and other totalitarian forms. But in fact, in the beginning, the intentions were good of using these systems of Körperkultur or body training to change society by changing the individual and also growing this kind of growing awareness of the power of the collective to transform society. Of course, this is a polemic discussion because, as we know now from all historical records, the avant-garde of course, brought wonderful revolutions in terms of artistic expression and new manifestations that completely broke free from the canon of art before. And set the standards still for many things of aesthetics that we still reference nowadays. We would have not have Bauhaus. So they are the foundations of still the foundations of modern art. But in any case, there was in many cases strong political, ideological agendas that were also moving these movements, these artistic movements. One example of this was the Futurists, of course, who were Marinetti, who made the first Futurist manifesto. Marinetti was a fascist and he was also a misogynist, so he hated women and considered women absolutely inferior, and anything female would have to be destroyed, humiliated, and shamed. And he advocated only for strength and war and progress and industrialization and speed. And he considered feminine everything that was against that. So this is for just one example. But still, the futurists, among many others, were some of the pioneers to start advocating what could be the new visions of the world, and also the new visions of the human. So the futurists have outlined rules for the movement of human bodies on stage, advising the actor to gesticulate geometrically in a draftsman-like topological manner, synthetically creating in mid-air cubes, cones, spirals, and ellipses. To explore these concepts, many futurist artists have built and performed with Übermarionetten, or life-size puppets, that would allow exploring with their geometry the idea of a dynamic sensation made eternal through mechanization. Already in the year 1909, Marinetti's first futurist manifesto had been published in Russia, providing Russian artists a strong weapon against the art forms of the past. Futurist ideals were adapted to support a cultural revolution that started in Russia with Mayakovsky's 1912 quasi-futurist manifesto, a slap in the face of public taste, and generated many artistic movements that would grow in the 20s, such as suprematism, Rayonism, and constructivism, this one seen as an ethical proclamation of a social and political revolution that would have a major influence in the development of the aesthetics of the modern movement. Constructivist artists believed that to surpass the academism in arts, speculative activities such as painting should be abandoned, and artists should use real space and real materials in performances in what they called production art. This kind of non-conventional theater joined many kinds of performance arts such as circus, puppetry, or music hall, and the movement of the human body was being studied with actors on stage through methods and practices such as the eurythmics of Émile Jacques Dalcroze, as we mentioned before, the eukinetics of Rudolf von Laban, who we saw in the picture at Monte Veritá, and Meyerhold's biomechanics. Meyerhold will become, in 1928, the director of the State Higher Theatre Workshop in Moscow, in Russia, where he developed biomechanics as a system of rules for actors based in physical discipline and self-awareness. This is a quote from Meyerhold. Since the art of the actor is the art of plastic forms in the space of a stage, he must study the mechanics of his body and train this material so that it is capable of executing instantaneously those tasks which are dictated externally. So, for an example of Meyerhold's extremely tough system of actor training, please take a look at figure 8.5, where you have here some examples of biomechanic exercises, which were meant to really train the body to this extreme level of fitness, but also to be able to have this kind of automatic response. Of course, the work of Meyerhold, as we can see here from this citat, it didn't give the actor much freedom for interpretation. The whole idea was that the director, who was working in the production of the play, would have a lot of control also on the ideas which were transmitted through the play, and of course through the movement of the actors. And the actors should be agents that were responsive to be able to transmit the ideas of the director on stage as accurately as possible. But this allowed for a new dynamic style of theater, and in the words of Meyerhold, the actor could base his art in scientific principles, transforming the entire creative act in a conscious process, and this would help him or her utilize correctly his body's means of expression to rouse the emotions of the spectator inducing him to stare at his performance, to share his performance. So the whole idea, this idea of psychological synchronism with the viewer, was that by using these movements, the viewer, through this process of empathy that we mentioned before, would be synchronized with the action on stage and so follow the emotion. And by following the emotion, being more susceptible to understanding the narrative and also to be transformed by the ideas that were being transmitted through the play. So one example of this, and of course the goal of these plays was to change society. Russian society was, so the avant-garde artists, they had many reasons to be discontent with many topics, for example, social inequality. So the idea of this kind of theater was to really bring this awareness to the people and to change society and transmit these ideas through theater. So one example of this was the play The Magnanimous Cult from 1922. It was Meyerhold's first stage constructivist performance, in which the actors were carefully placed and conducted by the director in a rhythmic production. So this idea of the rhythmic production is very important, because this psychological synchronism, which was created between the actor and the viewer, was not done only with one single actor, but also with the whole production of the play. So often the sets themselves also had movable elements, and all participants in the play were really extremely well synchronized. And this kind of rhythmic synchronization, of course, had a very powerful effect, because it propagated and it's also synchronized the audience. So the stage set for the Magnanimous Cult was designed by Popova, a female designer, and consisted of a series of apparatus that were assembled to each other, working as dynamic extensions of the actor's movement in space. So please take a look at figure 8.6, where we have here a photograph from this dynamic stage of Popova from the Magnanimous Cult from 1922. And you can see here, this is a typical constructivist stage set, where, of course, to be able to use this stage set, you see there's really strenuous elements that have to be used, and also very precarious. So ramps, very steep ramps, and steps, staircases, sliders, and planks. So the actors who used these stage sets, they really had to be extremely fit. They had to have a very important control of their body and body awareness, but also the way they were moving really followed a little bit like in a machine, really followed this kind of extremely well calculated rhythm. And you can see here a little bit, although it's a static image, you can see from the poses how everything looks pretty much well synchronized. So the Bauhaus would also be under the influence from such a constructivist approach, of course, through the influence of socialist thinking, since both the Ballet Russe and other artists from Eastern Europe were frequently touring through Germany. Performance art was a very important part of the Bauhaus curriculum, and especially in the pedagogy of Oskar Schlemmer. His course on Mensch, was based on the study of Dürer's system of proportion, Leonardo's canon of proportions, and the golden section. He also included in the course curriculum the study of the human biology and chemistry, of the growing steps since gestation to maturity, and also notions of psychology and philosophy. Schlemmer developed systems to study the mechanics and kinetics of the human body through notation, and staged diagrams of movement in space. These studies were the basis for his choreographies, reaching its peak in the Triadisches Ballet, which we celebrated now also the 100 years of Bauhaus, and at HFT we made an homage to the Wasteland. We made for Designgeschichte this homage to the Triadisches Ballet. Perhaps you had a chance of taking a look. And this was Oskar Schlemmer's most famous theater piece. In his diary of July 5th, 1926, Oskar Schlemmer writes why his ballet was given the name Triadic. And this is a citat. Because 3 is a dominant number in which the unitary self and his opposed dualist are suppressed, starting the collective. After that comes 5, then 7, and so on. The ballet should be understood as a dance of the triad, the switch from 1 with 2, then 3. Further, the triad is shape, color, and space, the 3 dimensions of space, height, width, and depth, the fundamental shapes, sphere, cube, and pyramid, the fundamental colors, red, blue, and yellow. A triad of dance, costume, and music. So this was the concept for the Triadisches Ballet. Of course, as you can see, Oskar Schlemmer emphasizes the 3, and because of this idea of the collective. And this, of course, has to do with this also the spirit of the Bauhaus. And he was a Bauhaus Meister, although, of course, in the Bauhaus was not as a completely harmonious environment. Quite the opposite. There were many different positions, many different approaches to design and to teaching, with very idiosyncratic mentors or masters. And Oskar Schlemmer had also his own ideas, but one thread that was common to the whole Bauhaus philosophy was to reform society through design. So there was, although the Bauhaus of course had different periods and had different different approaches to how to address this topic of changing society. In the beginning, more influenced by socialism, and then progressively with Mies van der Rohe, for example, closer and closer to the industry and also to corporate culture. But Oskar Schlemmer was very interested in this idea of the collective and of how using the theater to transport ideas and to convey these ideas to society. So also this kind of, like we saw from the communities and the people who were visiting Hellerau, and also in the sanatorium of Monte Veritá, this idea, this reforming spirit to reform society. So Oskar Schlemmer, for the Triadisches Ballet, for example, he was influenced by Pythagorean thinking, so in the theory, philosophy also of mathematics and Pythagoras. According to Pythagorean thinking, the number 3 was the number that embraced the totality of existence and mathematically originated the possibility of palpable extent. So also the reference to the 3, and that's where the triadic name comes from, has to do with transmitting what we have from the ideal plane to material existence. So for Plato, 3 was the number of the soul, and for Aristotle it was a beginning, a middle, and an end. Oskar Schlemmer was also very interested in classical culture, so of course he went back to the tradition of ancient Greece, also because he was interested in ancient Greece, also because of theater, of course, and because this idea of catharsis. To take a look at the costumes of the Triadisches Ballet, please look at images 8.7 and 8.8, where you have some examples here of the very famous costumes for the Triadisches Ballet. Oskar Schlemmer performed also with the students and with the group. He's here in the middle. Because it was also part of his teaching method to be to be not just directing, but to be working as a group collectively. So it was a part of Schlemmer's teaching philosophy, not just to be the detached professor or the detached master who gives instructions to the student, but he's a participating member also of this collective performance, and this was very important in his teaching method. And here we have the sketches for the costumes of the Triadisches Ballet, which you are lucky enough, or we are lucky enough, those of us who are living in Stuttgart, at the moment not, but as soon as the lockdown is over, everybody is invited, but you should go to Staatsgalerie and pay a visit to Oskar Schlemmer and take a look at the costumes of the Triadisches Ballet. And there's also many paintings of Oskar Schlemmer there, which are definitely worth to see. Of course, for many other artists, but in this case, since we are talking about Oskar Schlemmer, I think it was important to put it now in the context. So for Oskar Schlemmer, space was the unifying element in architecture and the common denominator of many of the interests among the Bauhaus staff. According to Goldberg, Rosalie Goldberg is an author who wrote about the theory of performance art. And this is a citat from Goldberg. To the 20s notion of felt volume, the Raumempfindung, Schlemmer's view added the idea of sensation of space, and this was the origin of his dance productions. So to really illustrate this idea of sensation of space, and why are we talking about Schlemmer and the futurists and the sensation of space? Because as you might remember in the beginning of this lesson, we started talking about phenomenology that has to do with the experience. So this idea of theater and movement is very connected to phenomenology, exactly in this way that it's referring to the sensation. So to illustrate these ideas of sensation of space as developed by Schlemmer, please take a look at figure 8.9 and 8.10, where you have two diagrams, where you have one diagram from Schlemmer and his idea of stereotomy of space. Sorry. We are all still experimenting with new technologies at work. So here you can see space represented as this cube, as this in the void, and then we have this diagram with all these diagonals and intersections and so, which can be seen as the possibilities of interaction in the body with space. And here we have a very similar idea, but illustrated through long exposure photography. This is a picture from Lux Feininger, also from the Bauhaus, that we see also a body in the center of space, and this idea of the diagonals in space grounding the space. And in this case, the long exposure photography was used to show the possibilities of movement, so superimposed, overlapped, to show that a body in motion, or the possibilities of the body in motion, but also to show that a static pose, and this is a very important idea of phenomenology, especially applying in architecture, or in this case, in your case, in interior design, when we are, and we don't have to be a dancer for this. This is the idea of phenomenology, as I mentioned in one of the other lessons. One of the most important citations from Merleau-Ponty says, "The eyes want to touch and the hands want to see." And this means, especially in connection with this image, that our bodies in space, we are not passive. Even if we are not moving, we might not be moving, but we are not passive. Because consciously or unconsciously, our body and mind, senses, is always calculating the possibilities of action, even if these possibilities of action might not be possible because our body has certain restrictions. But there's all these virtual possibilities of what can happen with the body in space. And this is triggered by the properties of the space and the properties of the body. So by the interaction between these two things that make it possible. Of course, imagination plays a big role. Of course, one's own physical constitution and so also interferes. But the way the space is designed in many ways gives cues or hints to what the body can do, and vice versa. The body is always an active agent which has intentions. Either we are aware or not aware. And then we act and we manifest these intentions in space by acting and interfering in the material world. And that's why humans have a natural instinct to transform their environment and to adapt this environment in a way that better serves our needs, but in a way also that better expresses our intentions and our desire of action in the world. So this image from Lux Feiniger is a very simple and clever way of depicting possibilities. And of course the possibilities in this case are just shown with the body in space. But the possibilities could be done regarding objects, regarding a chair or a table, and so many ways. The infinite possibilities and explore possibilities that can happen between body and space. So Schlemmer's system of teaching was based on place geometry, coordinating simple elements such as the straight line, the diagonal, the circle, and the curve. And according to his theory, a stereotomy of space evolves by moving the vertical line of the dancing figure in space. This stereometry could be felt if one were to imagine a space filled with a soft, pliable substance in which the figures of the sequence of the dancer's movements were to harden as a negative form. This is also a really important point because many of the Bauhaus Meisters were interested in this idea, but Schlemmer, specifically with his teaching method, was very interested in the negative space. Of course, this had the influence of Gestalt's theory, but the whole idea, as we see here, I will read the citat again. The stereotomy of space evolves by moving the vertical line of the dancing figure in space. So imagine a body in space, like we see here from the figures before. And now we imagine the space, the surrounding space, as a soft, pliable substance that could be felt. So if space would be like honey, or not water, but something a little bit more thick, more viscous, that one could feel while moving, in which the figures of the sequence of the dancer's movements were to harden as a negative form. So Schlemmer was interested in this idea of capturing movement, of capturing what happens when someone moves in space and is carving all this space as if it would be continuously doing a sculpture, not a sculpture like this, but the negative space, carving, constantly carving our way in. And if we could leave this space open, what appears as the track of the human body's actions in space. So Schlemmer was very interested in this idea of representing the felt space, the felt experiential space, and expressing it materially. So the square surface of the stage floor, for example, in Schlemmer's performance, was divided into bisecting axes and diagonals, completed by a circumscribing circle, and afterwards taut wire was crossed through the empty stage, defining the felt volume diagram of the cubic stage space. The multiple exposure photograph that we saw from Lux Feininger gives us an image that resembles a living performance of a standing Vitruvian man. You remember in the Renaissance, the Vitruvian man from Leonardo da Vinci? In motion, generating volumes with his body in the void of space. So please take a look at figures 8.11 and 8.12, where we have two more diagrams of Oskar Schlemmer. So one is a gesture dance, and the other one is the drawing from Mensch and Kunstfigur. And so in this case, it's a floor plan diagram, and this was a choreography for the movements, and this one very influenced by mechanical movements, but also integrated with these clear geometry shapes, such as the spiral and the circle, and so the performers would be performing these very elemental movements, also in a mechanic but also semi-ritualistic manner. And here we have another diagram from Oskar Schlemmer that shows this idea of the felt space. So, as a confessed admirer of classical philosophy, where he sustained his aesthetics and ethics according to the mythological opposition between Dionysus and Apollo, it is most likely that Oskar Schlemmer has devised his mathematical gesture dance by this phenomenological approach to Vitruvius' canonic tradition. Interestingly, besides Gropius, as Behrend's assistants and students, were also Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier, whose works would also be remarkably influenced by the same factory values of efficiency. Mies's work was initially closer to Behrend's corporate logic, and Le Corbusier would serve somewhere between factory efficiency and the phenomenological approach of expressionist architecture, while Mies quoted classical architecture, but was also highly influenced by Russian constructivism, aesthetics, and ideology. So here we see that not only Oskar Schlemmer was interested in these ideas and influenced by phenomenology, but there were also other figures at the Bauhaus that were really following these ideas. So it wasn't only Schlemmer; it was really the zeitgeist. It was the spirit of the time that people were really interested in these theories of aesthetics and absorbing these influences and of course manifesting them in their work. Of course, for example, Mies van der Rohe was also somewhat interested in constructivist aesthetics and ideology, and this might have led to his forced departure from Germany soon after he took the role of the director of the Bauhaus in 1930 after Gropius. But in this case, what would seem like a forced departure of Mies van der Rohe from his homeland would later prove to be his chance of developing his architectural ideas, and then he became a pioneer of the international style in the United States. Gropius' exile in the US led to the transmission of his experience as an architect, but mostly as a director of the Bauhaus in the pedagogical development of the universities like Harvard and MIT. In this case, it's also interesting to remember that Gropius, under the pseudonym Maas, had also been a member of the Glass Chain. And the glass chain was a utopian chain correspondence. So now we say with chain letters, for example, from the internet, which are not even so popular anymore. This is more for people of my age, not so much for you. But it was a chain correspondence that happened between a group of artists as a reaction to First World War and the consequent economic crisis. So they didn't have much work, and many of these members of the glass chain, they worked in expressionist architecture, so they were also a little bit a niche in itself. And the glass chain was founded in 1919 by Bruno Taut, whose synonym was glass. So they used a synonym so they couldn't be identified, and included, for example, Hans Scharoun with the name Hannes, and other, among other architects and designers. So this correspondence would last about a year, but its influence brought Expressionism to architecture, blooming especially through Mendelssohn's and Scharoun's work, but also being a very important inspiration for the idiosyncratic architecture of Rudolf Steiner. So for an example of some examples of the work of Rudolf Steiner, who was also a philosopher and social reformer, and was the founder of, probably you heard of, Waldorf education, was also invented by Rudolf Steiner, who also worked as an architect and devised his own specific, very idiosyncratic style of building. So for two examples, please take a look at figure 8.13 and 8.14, where you have two examples of anthroposophist architecture. Anthroposophy was this philosophy founded by Rudolf Steiner, which also had this intention, very strong ideas on social reform. So Rudolf Steiner, the leader of the anthroposophic movement, would take up Goethe's principles on spiritual science and apply them to an ecological approach that was embodied in his own approach to eurythmics. You remember we spoke about eurythmics before with Dalcroze, although the eurythmics of Rudolf Steiner, although they are also a system of movement, they are different from the eurythmics of Dalcroze. And these principles were applied to architecture, medicine, education, and agriculture. We made this jump now when we are putting, for example, the architecture of Rudolf Steiner. We are arriving, because we are talking about the avant-garde and how these Bauhaus and all these constructivist, futurist, how the avant-garde was really proponing these new ideas of changing the world, and of course expressing this through design and through building, but also through theater and performance, which were very important to present to the public and to shape the public sensitivity to the idea of the avant-garde. And of course this also led to the manifestation of expressionist architecture, which was very connected to this topic of movement. How you probably will see from examples of expressionist architecture that the idea of movement in space and how the space is designed is really important in expressionist architecture. So expressionist architecture was always a little bit, because of this, considered out of the norm, and therefore for some time relegated to a second plane in the architectural scene, as a consequence of its direct approach to the sensitive topic of emotion as transmitted through space. So this idea of emotion, we will see later why, became kind of polemic, because of course this idea of emotion and of transmitting emotions and narratives to space was also appropriated by propaganda and by totalitarian regimes, and also the idea of movement and the idea of using emotions to move people had led to mass movements, which had very difficult consequence. So we will explore this in the next lesson. So expressionist architecture also for a long time, because it didn't really fit. It didn't fit the purist aesthetic of the modern movement, was considered a little bit out of the norm. So modernist architects, which were kind of obsessed with finding the appropriate measurement and scale for all objects, from the spoon to the city, this was the Bauhaus motto, could not accept with ease that which couldn't be justified only through logic. So they were more interested in rationalization and not so much emotion, and most importantly scientific value in a very Cartesian sense. Still, as Rietvert is an author from the 20th century, puts it, the Bauhaus, the school which would explore and lead design towards the essential values of abstraction as transmitted by the pure essence of form and color, had also a dark side which made it interesting. And this dark side that Rietvert is referring to has to do with the direct influence of each of the school's masters and their interest in corporeal practices, but also some forms of spirituality. For example, Eaton, another of the Bauhaus Meisters, he had a very strict program with the students. The students had to go very early to bed and wake up before sunrise and fast. So and also doing these exercises, rhythmic exercises to decondition the body, and so Eaton really believed that this kind of training would develop the students' awareness, sensorial, perceptual awareness, and would make them more open to creativity, to open their creative channels. And of course, there was a lot of esotericism in these theories, and these are the aspects which are not so often discussed, but this was also a part of Bauhaus. So this is a citat from the Bauhaus Archive that kind of rounds up a little bit these different influences from the Bauhaus Meisters. The geometrical proposition of the human body had much focus in the German and the Russian avant-gardes of the 20s, especially at the Bauhaus, where, according to the Bauhaus archive, life drawing had always been a part of the school's curriculum. Different meisters, such as Feininger, Eaton, Klee, Schlemmer, Kur, and later on Jost Schmidt, held the course of life drawing successfully, setting individual focuses. In expressive studies, Eaton concentrated on the rhythmical coordination of the body limbs and on the body structure as a whole, and Klee was interested in the representation of the tectonics of the human body through linear drawings, whereby the articulations necessary to movement were emphasized as dots. So they were all really interested in addressing the human body. The human body, human perception, and human capacity for movement, although approached in all these different positions, was fundamental aspect of study of the Bauhaus curriculum. And this, of course, as you can extrapolate, influenced a lot how the students were sensitized to develop this kind of awareness to the human, awareness to the body, and how this influenced the way they thought about design. So according to Malgrave, and we are again talking about Hellerau and how Hellerau influenced, for example, the Bauhaus and all the people from the avant-garde who had the experience of being at Hellerau at Dalcroze's Institute. Among thousands of pre-war visitors who made pilgrimage to see the town of Hellerau and its activities at first hand were Ebenezer Howard, Martin Buben, George Bernard Shaw, Max Reinhardt, Serge Diaghilev, Thomas Mann, Stefan Zweig, Oskar Kokoschka, Emil Nolde, Hugo Ball, Heinrich Wölfflin, Max Klinger, Willem Worringer, Julius Meyer-Greff, Franz Kafka, and Upton Sinclair. Alma Mahler, the composer's widow and future wife of Walter Gropius, was also a visitor. Ada Brun, shortly to become the wife of Mies van der Rohe, was a student at the Institute from 1912 to 1913, and Mies himself visited the town on several occasions. Albert Jeanneret, the brother of Charles Edouard Jeanneret, later Le Corbusier, was an instructor under Dalcroze, and Le Corbusier visited Hellerau no fewer than 4 times. Other notable architects to visit Hellerau included Peter Behrens, Henri van der Velde, and Hans Pölzig. So you will probably remember from our other lectures, you probably recognized many of these names. So these people who were writing about empathy and who were writing about phenomenology and who were writing about the experience of space, they all had this experience as being at Hellerau, at this community, this kind of hippie community of alternative living. And they all had the experience of having this kind of body awareness training, which was eurythmics. So some of the names that we talked before: Henri van der Velde, Le Corbusier, we talked before and we will talk in the future, Walter Gropius from the Bauhaus, Hugo Ball, he was in Zurich, one of the early Dada artists, but also we mentioned Heinrich Wölfflin when we talked about empathy theories in the beginning. And there was someone else here in the list, of course, Peter Behrens. So also an important aspect, and in the next lesson we will talk a lot about Le Corbusier, or a little bit about Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier, who did the modular, who was supposed to be a system of design completely focused on the human body, although it was the male Le Corbusier body. Le Corbusier had this idea, and his brother was an instructor of the Dalcroze's eurythmics method. And Le Corbusier also had this experience. And for Le Corbusier had all his life this internal conflict of trying to reconcile body and mind, of designing holistically, although he lived in a very Cartesian way, that I have my rational side where I do total modernist right angle buildings, and I have also this other side, the expressionist side, where I use all the plasticity the material gives me, and emotional expression through light and color and so on. Although very rarely Le Corbusier was able to really reconcile these two poles, but he was working within this paradox. And that also makes Le Corbusier, as a creator, a fascinating character. So as a consequence of these influences, the rebellious spirit of the Bauhaus made the students tolerantly intolerable, according to Rickwert, and according to Eaton's principles, even the school's cantina was offering an exclusive macrobiotic influenced diet. Of course, for example, Oskar Schlemmer criticized this aspect, and he believed that there were more important things to explore and develop in the students besides concentrating on what they were putting on their stomachs. So again, this is a kind of funny expression of how the mentors also had, conflicts, different positions and different opinions on different things, so on teaching and positions on teaching. So for two other images of examples of the Dalcroze Institute, which had this very strong influence in Bauhaus, as you can see from this review, please take a look at figures 8.15 and 8.16, where you have two examples of groups of dancers in this community at Hellerau. figure 8.17 we have, because we mentioned now Eaton and the different Bauhaus meisters, and also here we have this picture of Eaton, Johannes Eaton, Bauhaus Meister, who had, you see from the picture, he dressed a little bit like something like an Eastern monk with a shaved head, and so. But Eaton was described as a very strong presence, sometimes also a kind of demonic intensity. So he was also a quite paradoxical character with many strong opinions and positions. Of course, probably also a little bit fascistic in his own way, methodology of approach to teaching and to Bauhaus. And at some point he left because there were disagreements between him and the management, and so there were some incompatibilities. But Eaton's pedagogy included gymnastics exercises with the students in order to experience, feel, and release the body through movement, followed by harmonization exercises, after which students stood at their easels and freely drew lines and twirls with both hands. So Eaton's idea was that to draw with the whole body and to use the whole body as a kind of expressive machine. And so he did this training with the students, not just drawing with the hand and the paper, but really focusing on all the movement of the body as a whole, and using this as a way to train their sensibility, to develop their creativity. So, for example, Malgrave continues to refer to Eaton's practice further by stating that the point of these activities, of these exercises, was to tap into the body's natural biological rhythm, which were generally followed by other exercises that focused on the material and texture, and which were intended to awaken the haptic senses, so the sense of touch by the contact with the material. So this very strong perceptual approach and direct approach to the material. It is interesting to note that most of Eaton's work at the Bauhaus generally refers to his studies on color, but in fact Eaton's teaching approach was a holistic approach, not just through painting. Eaton was very famous as a painter. So it was a holistic approach which explored the senses as media and perception and the creation of art as an embodied, multimodal understanding which involved the entire body. For this, he included in his classes the exploration with closed eyes of material samples such as wood, shavings, steel, wool, sheep's wool, and glass. So wool as a pressed form, but also sheep's wool as an unprocessed material, and glass. This interest in multisensory perception at the Bauhaus was also explored by Kandinsky, who was described as a synesthetic. So probably you heard of synesthesia. Synesthesia is this capacity of, for example, tasting something and seeing color. You maybe know this Disney film called Ratatouille, that this little mouse is he makes these food combinations he eats, and then we see how he sees these colors and these sensations, and so this is a very interesting example of synesthesia. Some people have synesthesia also when listening to music. While listening to music, they see in their mind's eye color, or they feel certain sensations. And Kandinsky was a painter, he was also a musician, and he was a synesthetic. So at the time, Kandinsky based his theories in teaching and also in painting on the simultaneous perceptions of color and sound. And he was also, to do this theory, he was also influenced by the studies of perception from Lipps and Wöhringer. So he was also very interested in psychology. Although our current theories explain now about synesthesia, because at the time Kandinsky was interested in synesthesia from the point of view of psychology, and from the point of view also as an artist, he was interested in this perceptual and also in the representation of synesthesia. But nowadays, with neuroscience, current theories explain or suggest that the phenomena of synesthesia only happens with some people. It doesn't happen with anyone. It might even happen as a brain defect or this rare biological disposition. But Kandinsky was deeply familiar with the psychological theories of empathy, like we mentioned before, as proposed by Lipps and Wöhringer. And in the two most important publications from Kandinsky, one is called Concerning the Spiritual in Art, and the other one is Point, Line and Plane. Kandinsky argues that colors and lines have not only a psychological effect in the retinal nerves, but also a deeper psychic effect, which he described as a biologically centered spiritual vibration. So Kandinsky was also very interested in spirituality and in Eastern thought, and he incorporated this with these ideas of perception and of philosophy, phenomenology, and the empathy theory from psychology. Kandinsky, like later Le Corbusier, was interested in, because of these topics, in forming an art which was scientific in this way, that would make the analysis of how lines in architecture affect perception, and following Wolflin's theory in order to determine the relationships of graphic formula to the spiritual atmosphere of the given time. So he was interested in analyzing how the spirit of a given time, the zeitgeist, and the way it's expressed in art and building, how they are related to human perception, and how do they take the manifestation they do. So Kandinsky would later be fascinated by the theories of Gestalt, which explored the dynamic aspects of perception. So this was a lot of theory today. You got a lot of information. I am sure you will have many questions. So please, like I said before in the beginning of the video, don't be shy, because there's many concepts here. You will also get, of course, you will get the texts and the images as usual. I have improved the German version of the texts, because one of you mentioned that there were some difficulties, so I found a better way to make the translation that I think is working better. But in any case, please write comments or write me an email, give me some feedback, and I will be very glad to answer your questions. And until the next lesson, thank you.